They pitied the one-legged parking attendant, dropping coins in his tip jar while avoiding eye contact. But when flames trapped dozens in the underground garage, this disabled man became something no one expected, and his missing leg told a story of heroism they never bothered to ask about. Miguel Santos had been working the downtown parking garage for 3 years, 8 months and 16 days. Not that anyone bothered to count except Miguel himself, who marked each shift in a small notebook he kept in his uniform pocket, a habit left over from his previous life, when counting days meant something entirely different. The Century Plaza parking garage stretched 5 levels beneath downtown Los Angeles, a concrete maze that served the business district above. Miguel worked the ground-level entrance, where professional people in expensive cars handed him their keys with the kind of hurried indifference reserved for those they considered beneath notice. He stood behind the small booth near the entrance ramp, his prosthetic left leg hidden beneath navy blue work pants, but the slight limp unmistakable as he moved between vehicles. The leg was high-tech, carbon fiber and titanium that had cost the VA more than most people made in a year. But to the customers, it was just evidence of his limitations. "Morning, Miguel," Dr. Sarah Chon would say as she handed him her BMW keys, her voice carrying the overly gentle tone people used with those they pitied. She'd worked in the medical building above for 2 years and had never once asked him about his service, though the small Marine Corps sticker on his name tag told the story. She didn't care to hear. The morning rush brought its usual parade awkward interactions. Business executives would hand him their keys while looking just past his shoulder, as if direct eye contact might somehow make them complicit in whatever tragedy had cost him his leg. Young professionals would drop extra coins in his tip jar, not because he needed them, but because it made them feel better about themselves. "Here you go, buddy," Mark Stevens, a real estate lawyer, would say each morning, adding a $5 bill to the jar. "Take care of yourself." The words were kind, but the tone carried the unmistakable pity reserved for the unfortunate, as if Miguel's missing leg had somehow diminished his ability to think, work, or live independently. Miguel never corrected their assumptions. He'd learned that explanations only made people more uncomfortable, and the truth of how he'd lost his leg was complicated in ways that most civilians couldn't process. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted to believe, that he was a victim of circumstance, someone to be pitied rather than honored. The parking garage was a perfect job for someone who preferred anonymity. The work was straightforward. Take keys, park cars, retrieve vehicles when customers returned. No complex social interactions, no need to explain his past, no requirement to prove his worth beyond basic competence. For a man who had once led Marines through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, parking cars was blissfully simple. But simplicity didn't mean invisibility. Despite Miguel's efforts to remain unnoticed, his coworkers, mostly younger men who saw the parking job as temporary, treated him with the awkward kindness reserved for someone they considered both older and disabled. "You sure you can handle that SUV, Miguel?" Tommy Rodriguez, barely 22 and full of misplaced concern, would ask whenever a customer brought in a particularly large vehicle. "I can take it if the clutch is too heavy for your leg." Miguel would smile and assure Tommy that he could manage. But the constant offers of help were reminders that others saw him as fundamentally limited. They meant well, but their assistance carried the implicit message that his missing leg made him less capable than he had been before. The customers were worse. During the afternoon rush, Miguel would watch them through the booth window as they waited for their cars, and he could see them discussing him in hushed tones. Fragments of conversations would drift back to him. Lost his leg in the war, I think. So sad? Probably can't get better work. At least he's trying. The pity was worse than outright hostility would have been. Hostility he could have understood, even respected. But pity reduced him to an object of sympathy rather than a person with agency, intelligence, and a history that extended far beyond his missing limb. Miguel had tried other jobs after his medical retirement from the Marines. He'd worked construction, where his prosthetic made him a liability on unstable surfaces. He'd tried office work, where his lack of a college degree limited his opportunities, and his military. Bearing made civilian managers uncomfortable. He'd even attempted security work, but companies were reluctant to hire someone they perceived as physically compromised. The parking garage job had been a compromise. Steady work that required minimal social interaction and played to his strengths. Miguel was excellent with logistics, could remember the location of dozens of vehicles simultaneously, and had the kind of systematic approach to organization that made the garage run more efficiently than it ever had before. But efficiency wasn't what people noticed when they looked at Miguel Santos. They saw the limp, the prosthetic leg that occasionally made a soft clicking sound when he walked, the careful way he positioned himself to maintain balance. They saw disability rather than ability, limitation rather than adaptation. The irony wasn't lost on Miguel. In Afghanistan, he had been responsible for the lives of 32 Marines, leading reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, where a single mistake could mean death for his entire unit. He had made life-or-death decisions under fire, coordinated complex operations across difficult terrain, and earned the respect of men who measured competence in the harshest possible terms. Here, people worried about whether he could safely park their cars. The transformation from Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, United States Marine Corps, to Miguel the parking attendant had been gradual and painful. The injury that cost him his leg had also ended a career that had defined his identity for 15 years. The Marines had been more than a job. They had been his family, his purpose, his understanding of who he was in the world. The explosion that changed everything had happened on a routine patrol outside Kandahar. Miguel's squad was investigating reports of an IED factory in a small village. When they walked into an ambush, the firefight lasted 6 hours, pinning down Miguel's unit in a compound with wounded Marines and dwindling ammunition. When air support finally arrived, they needed someone to guide the evacuation, helicopters to the correct landing zone while providing covering fire for the wounded. Miguel had volunteered, knowing that the position required someone to remain exposed while the rest of the squad moved to safety. The improvised explosive device that shattered his left leg had been hidden in the wall he was using for cover. The blast should have killed him, but Marine training had taught him to assess and respond even when injured. Despite compound fractures and severe blood loss, Miguel had continued to coordinate the evacuation, ensuring that all of his Marines reached the helicopters before allowing himself to be treated. The doctors at Walter Reed had saved his life and his leg, though the damage required 3 surgeries and ultimately led to an above-knee amputation. The physical therapy had been brutal, but Miguel had approached it with the same systematic determination that had carried him through Marine training. He learned to walk again, to run, to function with the prosthetic. That became an extension of his body rather than a limitation. But learning to live as a civilian with a missing leg had proven more difficult than any physical challenge the Marines had presented. The military had provided structure, purpose, and clear measures of success. Miguel had known exactly who he was and what he was capable of accomplishing. In the civilian world, His missing leg became the first thing people noticed about him, the lens through which they interpreted everything else about his capabilities and worth. He had tried to explain, in job interviews and social situations, that the prosthetic didn't limit his abilities in any meaningful way. He could walk, run, lift, and perform any task that didn't require specific use of a biological left leg. But explanations seemed to make people more uncomfortable rather than less, as if his competence, despite the prosthetic, was somehow threatening to their assumptions about disability. Eventually, Miguel had stopped explaining. He learned to accept the pity, the careful kindness, the assumption that his missing leg made him fundamentally different from other people. It was easier than constantly fighting misconceptions, and the parking garage job allowed him to avoid most social complications altogether. The work itself was satisfying in its simplicity. Miguel took pride in running an efficient operation, keeping accurate records, and maintaining the garage in better condition than it had ever been in before his arrival. The customers might see him as an object of pity, but the garage functioned smoothly under his management. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, was a middle-aged woman who treated Miguel with professional respect tinged with gentle concern. She never questioned his abilities, but Miguel could sense her worry about his limitations and her desire to be supportive without being patronizing. "Miguel, I've been thinking about moving you to the office position," she had said during his last performance review. "Less walking around, better for your leg. Same pay, less physical stress." Miguel had politely declined, explaining that he preferred the variety of the garage work. But Janet's offer, like the customer's tips and Tommy's assistance, carried the implicit message that others saw his missing leg as a barrier to full participation in normal activities. The assumption of limitation had become the most difficult part of his new life. Miguel knew exactly what he was capable of. He had tested those capabilities extensively during his recovery and had adapted his techniques to accommodate the prosthetic. But other people's discomfort with his missing leg created barriers that his actual abilities could not overcome. On quiet afternoons, when the garage was nearly empty and the city noise faded to a distant hum, Miguel would sometimes remember the weight of responsibility he had carried as a squad leader, the lives that had depended on his decisions, the trust his Marines had placed in his judgment, the pride he had felt in leading men through impossible situations. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a person who had existed before the explosion, before the prosthetic, before the careful pity of strangers, who saw limitation where he had once seen possibility. But Miguel Santos was still the same man who had earned the respect of his Marines through competence, courage, and unwavering commitment to their safety. The prosthetic leg hadn't changed his capacity for leadership, his ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, or his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. Those qualities simply remained hidden beneath the surface, invisible to people who saw only what they expected to see. When they looked at a man with a missing leg, the irony would soon become tragically clear. Tuesday morning started like any other day in the Century Plaza parking garage. Miguel arrived at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his official start time, and began his routine inspection of the facility. He checked the lighting on each level, tested the ventilation fans, and verified that the emergency exits were clear and accessible. It was more than his job required, but Miguel's military training had instilled habits that were difficult to break. Situational awareness, equipment checks, and contingency planning had kept his Marines alive in Afghanistan, and those same habits made him notice things that others missed, like the fact that the ventilation system on Level B3 had been making an unusual humming sound for the past week, and that the electrical junction box near the south stairwell had been sparking occasionally when the overhead fluorescence cycled on, and that the emergency lighting system hadn't been tested in the 6 months since he'd started paying attention to such details. Miguel had mentioned these concerns to Janet, who had assured him that maintenance would address them when budget allowed. But budget constraints and deferred maintenance were luxuries that combat veterans learned not to trust. In Afghanistan, overlooked details could get people killed. The morning rush proceeded normally. Dr. Chun arrived with her BMW, offering her usual careful smile and gentle greeting. Mark Stevens handed over his Lexus keys along with his customary $5 tip. Tommy Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes late, as usual, and immediately began apologizing for his tardiness, while offering to help Miguel with any heavy lifting. By 9 a.m., the garage was nearly full. The 5 underground levels held approximately 800 vehicles, and Tuesday morning brought close to capacity as business. People arrived for another day in the downtown corridor. Miguel estimated 600 cars on the 3 lower levels, with perhaps 150 people still in the garage, retrieving items from vehicles or making their way to the elevators. The first sign of trouble came at 9:23 a.m. Miguel was in the booth processing the morning receipts when he heard a sound that didn't belong. A sharp pop followed by a sustained electrical humming that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the building's infrastructure. He looked up from his paperwork and listened, his senses automatically sharpening in response to an anomaly. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a brief flicker in the fluorescent lighting that served the garage. Miguel stood and walked to the window of his booth, scanning the visible areas of level B1 for any signs of electrical problems. At 9:25 a.m., the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting the garage in the dim red glow that was supposed to guide people to safety in case of power failure. But Miguel noticed something that the emergency lighting couldn't address. A faint smell that shouldn't have been present in a concrete parking structure. Smoke. Miguel's military training took over before his conscious mind fully processed the situation. He grabbed the radio from his desk and called the security office on the ground floor. "Security, this is Miguel in the garage. We have a power failure and possible fire conditions. I'm implementing evacuation protocols." The voice that responded was confused and unprepared. Miguel, are you sure? The building management didn't mention any scheduled maintenance." "This isn't scheduled maintenance," Miguel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "I need you to call the fire department immediately and announce a building-wide evacuation. We may have a fire in the electrical systems." Miguel didn't wait for confirmation. He left the booth and began moving through level B1, his prosthetic leg clicking softly on the concrete as he quickly but methodically checked for people who might not have heard the evacuation announcement. The smoke smell was getting stronger, and Miguel could see a faint haze beginning to accumulate near the ceiling of the garage. His combat experience told him that they were in the early stages of what could become a very dangerous situation very quickly. "Excuse me, sir," he called to a businessman who was loading files into his car, apparently oblivious to the emergency lighting and growing smoke. "We need to evacuate the building immediately. Please leave your vehicle and proceed to the nearest exit." The man looked up, annoyed. "What's the problem?" "I just need to grab these documents." "Sir, there's a fire in the building," Miguel said firmly. "Leave everything and move to the exits now." The businessman's expression shifted from annoyance to concern as he noticed the emergency lighting and smoke for the first time. Oh my God. Is it serious? Miguel was already moving toward the next occupied vehicle. Yes, sir. Very serious. Please move quickly. As Miguel worked his way through level B1, he could hear confused voices echoing from the lower levels. The garage's public address system was connected to the building's main electrical system, which meant that the evacuation announcement wasn't reaching people on the underground levels. Miguel made a quick mental calculation. If the electrical fire was spreading through the building's infrastructure, the elevators would be shut down for safety. That meant approximately 600 people on 5 underground levels would need to evacuate using the stairwells, and many of them didn't yet know there was an emergency. He grabbed his radio again. Security, the PA system isn't working on the lower levels. I'm going down to coordinate evacuation from B2 through B5. Have the fire department stage at the south entrance. That's the fastest route out of the building. Miguel, maybe you should wait for the firefighters. There isn't time, Miguel said, cutting off the suggestion. People are trapped down there, and they don't know it yet. Miguel headed for the south stairwell, the fastest route to the lower levels. As he opened the stairwell door, he was hit by a wall of smoke that was significantly thicker than what he'd encountered on B1. The fire was below them, probably in the electrical systems that served the garage's lower levels. The smoke was acrid and chemical, the kind that came from burning plastic and electrical insulation. Miguel knew from his combat experience that this type of smoke was not only toxic, but could quickly become thick enough to cause disorientation and panic. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth and began descending the stairs, his prosthetic leg handling the concrete steps with the mechanical precision that 15 months of physical therapy had made automatic. Level B2 was chaos. The emergency lighting was barely functional, creating a dim red maze of shadows and confusion. The smoke was thick enough to make breathing difficult and visibility limited to perhaps 10 feet. Miguel could hear voices calling out in the darkness, people who had been separated from their cars, people who couldn't find the exits, people who were beginning to panic as they realized the magnitude of the situation. Everyone listen to me, Miguel called out, his Marine training automatically projecting his voice to carry through the space. This is an emergency evacuation. I need everyone to move toward the sound of my voice. A woman's voice came back from somewhere in the smoke. I can't see anything. Where are the exits? Follow my voice, Miguel called back. I'm going to guide you out. Stay calm and move slowly. Miguel began moving through level B2, using the dim emergency lighting and his memory of the garage layout to locate people who were disoriented by the smoke and darkness. He found Dr. Chun crouched beside her BMW, coughing and clearly frightened. Dr. Chun, it's Miguel from the parking booth. I'm going to get you out of here. Miguel? She looked up at him with relief and confusion. What's happening? Electrical fire, Miguel said, helping her to her feet. The smoke is getting worse. We need to move to the stairwell right now. As Miguel guided Dr. Chun toward the south exit, he could hear more voices calling from deeper in the level. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute, and he realized that the evacuation was going to take longer than the available time would allow. Level B3 was worse. The smoke was so thick that Miguel had to feel his way along the walls, and the emergency lighting had failed completely. He could hear people coughing and calling for help, but visibility was nearly zero. Can anyone hear me? Miguel shouted into the darkness. Multiple voices responded, coming from different directions. Miguel quickly counted, at least 8. People were still trapped on this level alone, and the smoke was becoming dense enough to cause serious respiratory distress. Miguel made a decision that would have been familiar to any Marine. who had served under his command in Afghanistan. When facing a crisis with limited time and resources, you prioritize saving the most people possible, even if it means taking personal risks that might not be tactically sound. He was going to have to go back and forth multiple times, leading small groups to safety through smoke. That was getting thicker with each passing minute. His prosthetic leg, which people above ground saw as a limitation, was about to become irrelevant in the face of a crisis that would test everything else he was capable of. Miguel Santos, the parking attendant that people pitied, was about to remember exactly who he had been before the explosion changed his life. And the people trapped in the smoke-filled garage were about to discover that heroes don't retire just because they leave pieces of themselves on the battlefield. The real evacuation was just beginning. Miguel worked his way through level B3 with the systematic efficiency of a man who had once navigated Taliban tunnels in complete darkness. The smoke was thick enough that he had to feel along the concrete walls to maintain direction, but his spatial memory mapped every support pillar, every parked car, every potential obstacle between the trapped people and the stairwell exit. "Everyone stay where you are and keep talking," he called into the darkness. "I'm coming to get you, but I need to hear your voices to find you. Over here." A man's voice, maybe 30 feet to his left. "I'm by the blue Honda." A woman, closer, near the east wall. "My wife fell down. She can't breathe." Panic in that voice, somewhere deeper in the level. Miguel processed the locations and distances, automatically calculating the most efficient rescue sequence. In Afghanistan, this kind of tactical assessment had saved lives when his squad was pinned down under fire. Now it would save civilians trapped by smoke and fear. He found the woman by the Honda first, elderly, maybe 70, sitting on the concrete floor and coughing violently. The smoke was affecting her more severely than it would younger people. "Ma'am, I'm Miguel. I work here. I'm going to help you get out." She looked up at him through watery eyes. "I can't see anything." "Is the building on fire?" "Yes, ma'am, but we're going to get you to safety." Miguel helped her to her feet, noting that she was unsteady but mobile. "I need you to hold on to my belt and follow me exactly. Don't let go no matter what." As Miguel guided her toward the stairwell, his prosthetic leg clicked softly on the concrete, a sound that was usually a source of self-consciousness, but now served as an audio beacon in the darkness. "The clicking sound is my leg," he explained as they moved. "Follow that sound if you can't see me." They reached the stairwell, where the smoke was slightly thinner due to the building's ventilation patterns. Miguel helped the woman onto the stairs and gave her clear instructions. "Go up slowly, stay to the right side of the stairwell, and don't stop until you reach ground level. There will be people there to help you." "What about you?" "I'm going back for the others." Miguel returned to level B3, where the smoke had grown noticeably thicker in the few minutes he'd been away. He could hear coughing and increasingly panicked voices from multiple directions. He found the man who had called out first, a business executive in his 50s, who was disoriented and showing early signs of smoke inhalation. "Sir, I'm Miguel. I'm here to get you out." "Thank God. I thought I was going to die down here." "Not today," Miguel said with the quiet confidence of someone who had made similar promises to wounded Marines. "Hold on to my belt and follow me." As they moved toward the stairwell, Miguel called out to the other trapped people, "I'll be back for everyone. Stay low where the air is cleaner and keep talking so I can find you." The executive was in better physical condition than the elderly woman, and Miguel was able to move more quickly through the smoke. When they reached the stairwell, Miguel noticed that the man was staring at his prosthetic leg with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. "You're?" You're going back in there again? Yes, sir. But your leg? Miguel looked at him with the steady gaze that had once reassured. Marines facing impossible odds. My leg works fine, sir. Get to safety. The third trip into level B3 brought Miguel to the most critical situation, the couple where the wife had collapsed. He found them near the center of the level, where the smoke was thickest. The woman was unconscious, and her husband was in near panic. She just stopped breathing normally, the man said when Miguel reached them. I think she's having a heart attack. Miguel knelt beside the woman and quickly assessed her condition. She was breathing but shallowly, and her pulse was rapid but steady. Not a heart attack, smoke inhalation. Complicated by panic and possibly a pre-existing respiratory condition. She's going to be okay, Miguel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had treated wounded Marines under fire. But we need to get her out of here immediately. Miguel had carried wounded soldiers before, but never with a prosthetic leg and never through smoke so thick that visibility was essentially zero. The physics were different. The balance points had changed, but the fundamental principle remained the same. You adapt your technique to the situation, and you get the job done. He lifted the unconscious woman in a fireman's carry, distributing her weight across his shoulders in a way that allowed his prosthetic leg to provide stable support. The clicking sound of the artificial joint was more pronounced under the added weight, but the titanium and carbon fiber construction held steady. Stay right behind me, Miguel told the husband. Hold on to my belt and don't let go for any reason. The journey to the stairwell was the longest. 90 seconds of Miguel's civilian life. The woman's weight pressed down on his shoulders. The smoke burned his lungs, and his prosthetic leg worked harder than it ever had since his recovery. But the mechanical precision of his movement, the systematic navigation through the obstacle course of parked cars, the calm authority of his voice directing the husband behind him, all of it felt familiar in a way that reminded him who he had been before the explosion. They reached the stairwell, where Miguel carefully transferred the unconscious woman to her husband and a firefighter who had just arrived from above. She needs oxygen immediately, Miguel told the firefighter. Smoke inhalation, possibly complicated by pre-existing respiratory issues. The firefighter looked at Miguel with professional recognition. Are you medical? Former combat medic, Miguel said, not mentioning that his primary role had been squad leader. There are at least 5 more people on this level, and I haven't even started on B4 and B5. Sir, we need you to evacuate with the others. This is too dangerous for civilians. Miguel looked at the firefighter with the same expression he had once used to address young Marines who questioned orders they didn't understand. Firefighter, I know this building better than anyone. I can navigate in 0 visibility, and there are people down there who will die if we wait for you to set up a full response. I'm going back. The firefighter hesitated, clearly recognizing something in Miguel's bearing that suggested this wasn't a civilian having a hero moment. What's your background, sir? Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, United States Marine Corps, 15 years active duty, including 4 deployments to Afghanistan. I've run rescue operations in collapsed buildings under enemy fire. This garage is safer than most places I've worked. The firefighter stepped aside. Be careful, Sergeant. We'll have more personnel here in 5 minutes. Miguel was already heading back into the smoke. Levels B3, B4, and B5 became a continuous operation that lasted 47 minutes and tested every skill Miguel had learned in 15 years of Marine service. He evacuated 23 people from the 3 lowest levels of the garage, including 2 children who had been visiting the building with their parents, an elderly man with a walker who who required special assistance, and a pregnant woman who was having difficulty breathing. Each rescue required a different approach. The children were small enough that Miguel could carry both of them simultaneously, but they were terrified by the smoke and darkness. He calmed them with the same steady voice he had once used to reassure wounded Marines, telling them stories about brave knights as he guided them through the darkness. The elderly man with the walker couldn't move quickly, but he was determined and clear-headed. Miguel modified his technique, serving as a human guide rail, while the man used his walker to navigate the smoke-filled level at his own pace. The pregnant woman required the most careful handling. Miguel recognized signs of respiratory distress that could be dangerous for both mother and baby, so he carried her to the stairwell and then stayed with her, monitoring her breathing and keeping her calm until paramedics arrived. Throughout the operation, Miguel's prosthetic leg performed flawlessly. The clicking sound that people above ground found uncomfortable became a lifeline for people trapped in complete darkness, a steady, reliable audio beacon that guided them to safety. The mechanical precision of the artificial joint provided stability and support that biological muscles might have struggled to maintain under the stress of repeated rescues. By the time Miguel emerged from the garage for the final time, the Century Plaza building was surrounded by fire trucks, ambulances, and news crews. The electrical fire had been contained to the building's lower levels, but the smoke damage was extensive, and the evacuation had been complex, enough to qualify as a major emergency response. Miguel found himself standing in the bright afternoon sunlight, covered in soot and smoke residue, as paramedics checked him for signs of smoke inhalation. Around him, the people he had rescued were being treated, reunited with families, and interviewed by news reporters who wanted to understand how such a successful evacuation had been coordinated. Dr. Sarah Chun approached him as a paramedic was clearing him for release. "Miguel," she said, her voice carrying a tone he had never heard before, not pity, not careful kindness, but genuine respect. "I wanted to thank you. You saved my life." Miguel nodded politely. "Just doing my job, Dr. Chun." "No," she said firmly. "What you did in there, that wasn't parking cars. That was something else entirely." Other people began to gather around Miguel, the elderly woman from B3, the businessman, the husband whose wife was recovering in an ambulance. One by one, they thanked him, but Miguel could see the confusion in their faces. This wasn't the same man they had been dropping pity tips for over the past 3 years. Mark Stevens, the real estate lawyer who had been giving Miguel $5 bills every morning, stared at him with open bewilderment. "Miguel, how did you know what to do in there? How did you stay so calm?" Miguel looked at the crowd of people whose lives he had saved, people who had seen him every day for years without really seeing him at all. The question they were really asking wasn't about training or experience. It was about the fundamental disconnect between who they thought he was and who he had revealed himself to be. "Mr. Stevens," Miguel said quietly, "I was a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps for 15 years. I lost my leg in Afghanistan while evacuating wounded Marines under enemy fire. Before I worked in your parking garage, I was responsible for the lives of 32 Marines in some of the most dangerous territory on earth." The crowd around him grew silent as the implications of his words settled in. "You've been dropping tips in my jar for 3 years because you felt sorry for the disabled parking attendant," Miguel continued. "But I've never been disabled. I've been adapting, surviving, and serving in whatever capacity was available to me. Today, the capacity happened to be rescuing civilians from a burning building." Dr. Chun's eyes filled with tears as she realized the magnitude of their collective misunderstanding. Miguel, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? Miguel looked at her with the patience of someone who had learned difficult lessons. About human nature, Dr. Chun. Would you have believed me if I had told you 3 years ago that the one-legged, parking attendant was a decorated Marine veteran? Or would you have assumed I was embellishing my background to gain sympathy? The silence that followed was answer enough. A voice from behind the crowd interrupted the moment. A news reporter who had been interviewing other evacuees. "Excuse me, sir? I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I understand you coordinated the evacuation of the parking garage. Could we speak with you?" Miguel looked at the reporter, then at the crowd of people whose opinions of him had been fundamentally altered in the span of a single afternoon. For 3 years, he had been invisible to them except as an object of pity. Now, suddenly, they wanted to understand who he really was. But the answer to that question was more complicated than a news interview could capture. Miguel Santos was the same person who had parked their cars every morning. A man who approached his work with systematic efficiency, who took pride in doing his job well, who treated every customer with respect regardless of how they treated him. The only difference was that today, his job had required skills that civilians couldn't see from behind the safety of their assumptions about disability and limitation. "Ma'am," Miguel said to the reporter, "I'm not a hero. I'm a Marine who lost his leg in service to his country and has been working an honest job to support himself since his medical retirement. Today, that job required me to help people get out of a dangerous building. Tomorrow, it will require me to park cars again. But sir, what you did today—" "What I did today is what any Marine would do in the same situation," Miguel said. "We're trained to adapt and overcome, to put the safety of others before our own comfort, and to serve in whatever capacity is required. My missing leg doesn't change any of that." Miguel turned to address the crowd of people he had rescued. "I need all of you to understand something," he said. "There are thousands of veterans working jobs that you probably consider beneath them, being treated with pity instead of respect, having their capabilities questioned because of visible or invisible wounds from their service. The man who bags your groceries might be a former Navy SEAL. The woman who cleans your office might be a retired Army officer. The guy who delivers your packages might have saved lives in Iraq or Afghanistan." He paused, looking directly at each person in the group. "You don't need to thank me for today, but maybe you could start by seeing the veterans around you as the people they actually are, instead of the people you assume them to be." Miguel Santos had spent 3 years being invisible to the people whose lives he had just saved. But as he walked away from the crowd of reporters and grateful evacuees, heading back to check on the status of the parking garage, that was still his responsibility. He realized that invisibility had been a choice rather than a condition. He had allowed people to see only what they expected to see, because it was easier than constantly challenging their assumptions. But today had reminded him that some challenges were worth facing, not for his own sake, but for the sake of other veterans who deserved to be seen for who they really were. The one-legged parking attendant had revealed himself to be exactly what he had always been, a United States Marine who served others regardless of the circumstances, who adapted to overcome any obstacle, and who never stopped being ready to answer the call when people needed help. His missing leg hadn't made him less capable. It had simply made other people more comfortable with their own assumptions about what capability looked like. But assumptions, Miguel had learned, were just another obstacle to overcome. And Marines, as everyone now knew, were very good at overcoming obstacles. 6 months after the Century Plaza fire, Miguel Santos received a letter that would complete a circle that had begun 3 years earlier with his first day as a parking attendant. The letter came from the Los Angeles Fire Department, officially commending his actions during the evacuation and recommending him for the Civilian Medal of Valor. But attached to the official commendation was a personal note from Fire Chief Robert Martinez, himself a Marine veteran. Staff Sergeant Santos, the note read, "It has come to our attention that your service record includes combat actions in Afghanistan that were never properly recognized due to the classified nature of your final deployment. The Marine Corps has requested permission to present you with the Silver Star for your actions in Kandahar, which directly led to your injury. The ceremony will be held at Camp Pendleton with your permission." Miguel stared at the letter for a long time, thinking about the journey from staff sergeant to Perking, attendant to reluctant hero. The Silver Star was an honor he had never expected to receive. Recognition for actions that had cost him his leg, but saved the lives of his Marines. But the real recognition had come 6 months earlier, in the smoke-filled parking garage where people had finally seen him for who he truly was. The Medal of Valor ceremony was held at Los Angeles City Hall, with Mayor Patricia Williams presenting the award to Miguel in front of an audience that included the 23 people he had rescued from the garage. Dr. Chun was there, along with Mark Stevens, Tommy Rodriguez from the parking garage, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Miguel's actions. But the most meaningful moment came when Miguel's former Marines, men he had served with in Afghanistan, arrived in dress blues to honor their former squad leader. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had served under Miguel for 2 deployments, spoke for the group. "Sir," she said, addressing Miguel with a respect that had never diminished, despite his civilian job, "we want you to know that losing your leg never changed who you are to us. You're still the Marine who brought us all home, who taught us that service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of both medals, the Civilian Medal of Valor for his actions in the parking garage, and the Silver Star for his service in Afghanistan. Miguel stood at attention as the decorations were pinned to his chest, his prosthetic leg supporting him with the same reliability it had shown during those crucial 47 minutes in the smoke. After the ceremony, Miguel returned to work at the Century Plaza parking garage, which had reopened after extensive repairs and safety upgrades. But everything had changed in the way people saw him. Dr. Chun no longer spoke to him with careful pity, but with the respect due to a fellow professional. Mark Stevens shook his hand each morning and asked about his family, treating him as an equal rather than an object of charity. Tommy Rodriguez still offered to help with heavy lifting, but now it was the offer of one colleague to another rather than able-bodied to disabled. The transformation extended beyond the garage. Miguel was invited to speak at veteran events, to share his story with other wounded warriors who struggled with the transition to civilian life. His message was simple but powerful. Your value as a person isn't determined by what you've lost, but by what you choose to do with what remains. The parking garage job, which had once been a refuge from a world that didn't understand his capabilities, became a platform for demonstrating that service takes many forms. Miguel continued to park cars with the same systematic efficiency he had always shown, but now his work was seen as part of a larger story of adaptation and perseverance. 1 year after the fire, Miguel was offered a position with the Los Angeles Fire Department as a civilian emergency coordinator, specializing in building evacuations and veteran outreach. He accepted the job, but with one condition: he would continue working part-time at the parking garage, because he had learned that every job had the potential to become an opportunity to serve others. On his last full day as a parking attendant, Miguel stood in the booth where he had worked for nearly 4 years, looking out at the garage that had become the unexpected setting for his return to recognition. The prosthetic leg that had once marked him as an object of pity had proven to be simply another tool for accomplishing his mission. Dr. Chun approached the booth as she had every morning for years. But this time she carried something other than car keys. "Miguel," she said, "I wanted to give you this before you start your new job." She handed him a framed photograph taken during the Medal of Valor ceremony, showing Miguel in his dress uniform with his medals, surrounded by the people he had rescued and the Marines who had served under his command. "I want you to remember," Dr. Chun said, "that heroes don't become heroes by being perfect. They become heroes by being themselves when it matters most." Miguel looked at the photograph, seeing in it the convergence of two parts of his life that had seemed irreconcilably separate: the Marine he had been and the civilian he had become. The prosthetic leg was visible in the photo, but it was no longer the defining characteristic that people noticed first. "Dr. Chun," Miguel said, "thank you for learning to see me. Thank you for teaching us to see past our assumptions." As Miguel prepared to leave the garage for the final time as a full-time employee, he reflected on the lessons of the past 4 years. He had learned that invisibility was sometimes a choice, that assumptions could be as limiting as any physical barrier, and that service took many forms. Some of them as simple as parking cars with dignity and treating every customer with respect. But most importantly, he had learned that losing a leg in Afghanistan hadn't made him less of a Marine. It had simply changed the battlefield on which he served. The prosthetic leg that clicked softly as he walked away from the garage had carried him through smoke and flames to save 23 lives. It had supported him as he stood at attention to receive decorations for valor. It had proven that limitation was often a matter of perception rather than reality. Miguel Santos, the one-legged parking attendant who people had pitied for years, had reminded an entire city that heroes don't retire, they just find new ways to serve. His war was far from over, but he had learned that every battle, whether fought in Afghanistan or in a smoke-filled parking garage, was ultimately about the same thing: standing between innocent people and harm, regardless of the cost to yourself. The clicking sound of his prosthetic leg faded as Miguel walked into the Los Angeles sunshine, heading toward his next mission in a life dedicated to service. Behind him, the parking garage stood as a monument to the truth that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important heroism happens when no one is watching, except that someone is always watching, and sometimes, when the moment demands it, heroes reveal themselves to be exactly who they have always been. True disability is not the inability to walk on 2 legs. It's the inability to see past our assumptions about what strength looks like. Sometimes the person we pity carries more courage in their adapted stride than we carry in our comfortable certainty. Asterisk. This story is dedicated to all the wounded warriors who continue to serve in whatever capacity they can, and to those who have learned to see past surface limitations to the strength that lies beneath. 5 years after the Century Plaza fire, Miguel Santos stood before a packed auditorium at UCLA Medical Center, addressing a conference on veteran reintegration and civilian perception of disability. His prosthetic leg clicked softly as he walked to the podium, but the sound no longer carried the weight of pity. It had become a symbol of adaptation and strength. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miguel began, looking out at an audience of healthcare workers, veteran advocates, and fellow amputees, "I want to tell you about the most important lesson I learned in a smoke-filled parking garage." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. It wasn't about rescue techniques or emergency response. It was about the difference between being invisible and being unseen. For 3 years, I was invisible to the people whose cars I parked every day. But I was never unseen by the Marines who served with me, by my family, or by the person I saw in the mirror each morning. Miguel gestured toward his prosthetic leg. This leg doesn't define my limitations. Your assumptions about it do. When I carried 23 people out of that garage, my leg didn't suddenly become more capable. Your perception of what it meant to have a prosthetic leg changed. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Every day, wounded veterans go to work in jobs that society considers beneath them, carrying skills and experiences that could save lives, solve problems, and lead teams. But we see only their visible wounds and make invisible their capabilities. Miguel's voice carried the authority of someone who had lived both sides of the equation. The question isn't whether disabled veterans can contribute to society. The question is whether society can see past disability to recognize the strength that lies beneath. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. But Miguel remained focused on a single truth. Recognition was never the goal. Service was the goal. Recognition was simply what happened when people finally learned to see clearly. As Miguel left the auditorium that day, his prosthetic leg clicking in rhythm with his natural stride, he carried with him the knowledge that every step was both an ending and a beginning. The end of one person's assumptions, and the beginning of their understanding that strength comes in many forms. The parking garage where it all began still bore a small plaque near the entrance. In honor of those who serve without recognition and protect without fanfare. Sometimes heroes park cars. Miguel smiled every time he saw it, knowing that the greatest victory wasn't the medals or the recognition. It was the understanding that every job, no matter how humble, was an opportunity to serve. And that service, not pity, was what veterans had always deserved. His war continued, but now he fought it on ground of his own choosing, with weapons of his own making, and with the knowledge that being seen clearly was sometimes the greatest victory of all. Asterisk, the measure of a person is not what they have lost, but what they choose to do with what remains. And sometimes what remains is everything that ever mattered. Asterisk.